studios in New York City, this is Charlie Rose.
General Stanley McChrystal is here. He was commander of the International Security Assistance Force and the United States forces in Afghanistan from 2008 to 2009. He also played a key role in Iraq as commander of the Joint Special Operations Command. He was instrumental in the capture of Saddam Hussein and the killing of Abu Massad Zarqawi. His memoir, My Share of the Task, has just been released in paperback. It comes at a time when both Iraq and Afghanistan are facing renewed and violent insurgencies. I'm pleased to have Stanley McChrystal back at this table. Welcome.
Thank you, Charlie. I appreciate it.
We want to talk about many things, including where you are today and where you're going forward, but also look back at where you have some advantage of experience and insight. Afghanistan. Where are we in your judgment on the ground there as they prepare to leave most troops by 2014 and maybe all?
Yeah, I think we're in a sensitive period in Afghanistan, but then, of course, in the last 15 years, what hasn't been? I think that militarily or security-wise, there's been a lot of gains made. Yeah. And those gains are shown on the ground in the relative life of the people. I think in terms of government, there's been great problems. Internal to the Afghan government, there's been a real difficulty in getting local governance, adequate, competent local administration, technocrats down to low levels, which builds confidence of the people. And then at the national level, there's been a problem with them being able to be a credible national government. I don't think that's impossible for them, but it's been a challenge. And then the third, which I think people forget sometimes, is I think the Afghan people have moved to a different place. I think that particularly young people, not just those in school we talk so much about, but those who maybe have graduated from school, and Afghan females and a lot of other Afghans are not ready to go back in time. They're not ready to go back to pre-9/11. They're not ready to go back to 1990. They're not ready to go back to 1978. So when people talk about Afghanistan and what will happen in the future, and they immediately pull out a history book and they say, this is what will happen, I think it's a different Afghanistan. Now, they're still fraught with dangers because that political weakness could break into violence in the groups. I don't think the Taliban can take over. I just don't think they're strong enough. But I think there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty, and the Afghan people are plagued by that what happens next question.
What mistakes did the United States and its allies make in Afghanistan?
A number. I think that I'm going to include Afghans in our allies. Sure. If we go back just to 9/11 and we say that we went in sort of unexpectedly after the al-Qaeda elements that were there, we suddenly found ourselves having toppled the Taliban government without really having thought, what next? Now we have a country that had been through about 20 years of war at that point. It was badly damaged, had very little infrastructure or personal capital into human capital in terms of putting against governance and whatnot. And we thought that we could do things more cheaply than we did. We thought we could say that the Germans would do the police, the Italians would do the courts, the Americans would do the army, and a few other things, and we would slide out. And that just wasn't realistic. It was going to take a much bigger international effort. And in our haste and sometimes our ignorance, we allowed a number of what I call non-traditional leaders, warlords in many cases, people to gather economic, political, and sometimes military power. We allowed them to get into places sometimes where they'd been before. And what that signaled to the Afghan population is that here we go again. We are going back to a bad old days that really was what preceded the Taliban. So the Afghan people said, well, we're just leaving the Taliban period. The danger is we're going to go back to what we hated about that pre-Taliban period. So I think we lost confidence amongst many Afghans during that 2001 to 2004 period. The Taliban saw opportunity. They came back in and they said, look, what's happening? You're going back to the bad old days, and the Americans are not going to solve your problem. And they started to find fertile ground, not initially in huge places, but slowly. And so they were able to grow up their political power and, in some cases, military. And so we made mistakes in not seeing that happen early enough, not reacting to it strongly enough when we did. We were under-resourced in many ways, but probably most we were under-resourced in understanding. We didn't study the problem enough. We didn't learn the language enough. we didn't take a long-term, truly consistent, focused approach to it.
We did not leave a residual force there. Do you believe if there had been a residual force of perhaps 10,000 people or more, soldiers, that we would not see the conflict we see today?
There's no way to guarantee that, but I think the chances are that we would have a better situation there now. I think the demonstration of continued partnership with the government of Iraq could have been a factor that would have given the Sunnis more confidence that they were going to have an ability to be more fairly.
And perhaps we would have been able to persuade the Prime Minister of that as well.
We certainly lost a terrific amount of our leverage with the Prime Minister when we were gone. Now, I understand the desire to be gone, but I think that it also signaled to the region that we had touched the stove and it was too hot and we were going to withdraw our hands. And I think that while we don't want to stay places with huge numbers of people, we must stay engaged in parts of the world.
If we had left a residual force, what would they have done?
I think that most likely they would have largely done training, professionalization of Iraqi forces, logistics, support, and things. But to a certain degree, they would have also been a demonstrated commitment, a demonstrated partnership.
But if you look at Iraq, the president prepared to negotiate to keep a residual force there. It wasn't like we didn't want to have one. It was the negotiations, as I understand it, were unsuccessful.
That's my understanding as well. And, of course...
And they may be unsuccessful in Afghanistan as well.
They may be indeed.
And then you have the reality that the Iraqi foreign minister is saying to the Afghans, don't make the mistake we did and not keep some Americans there. But they may. Which brings me to this question. You were one of the people who had a relationship with Hamid Karzai. I don't understand him. I don't understand why, after all this, he still seems, either he's just purely political and perhaps corrupt, or likely corrupt, and yet, after all that America has done, and he wouldn't be in power without America, he seems so resentful.
There's a saying that says that give somebody something and the first person they hate is you. And Bob Comer wrote a paper near the end of the Vietnam War that said the paradox of counterinsurgency is the client state that you are helping soon finds itself less committed to it than you do. The donor cares more than the recipient. I think that in the case of Afghanistan, there's a number of things at work here. First, I think many of the Afghan people are trying to come to grips with what they think is imminent abandonment. Right. And I think that many of them are trying to steel themselves that we are going to leave, so they are emotionally and physically prepared for that.
Because it has happened before.
That's correct. I think President Karzai, and I certainly wouldn't presume to do a psychological study, but I think that if you see his relationship with the United States, it's underpinned with some very practical things. He doesn't want to be portrayed as a puppet
as Washington's
people.
Man.
That's right.
Give us the secret of, or at least your own sense of how you should engage him by showing him the respect, by trying to gain his confidence, by trying to disavow him of his worst instincts.
Yeah. And I certainly have no secret, and I think it's just dealing with people. The first thing I did was view him as an elected leader of a nation, not as a client of the United States that worked for me or was dependent upon us. He was a sovereign leader of a nation. And when I first went to see him the first time, it was not tradition for Americans to be in anything but our battle uniform. But I took my dress green uniform for my first meeting with him. I dressed in that and went to see him, which was my attempt to show him special respect and to almost like I was presenting my credentials as I was an arriving person. I also tried to communicate to him that this was not only his nation, this was his war, and that I was the commander of NATO troops, but in reality, I was supporting the Afghan army's fight for the war. Now, he had never viewed it as their war. He had viewed the war in Afghanistan as something that they were reluctantly allowing the West to fight on their territory because it benefited them, but they didn't like that. And what I tried to do was convince them this is a war for national survival, and it's your war. And you have got to take the role as commander-in-chief in doing that. I don't claim that we got all the way to that, but I made efforts to establish that.
What is it, the 3 or 4 things that you think is essential to communicate to the young people of Yale, or if you were asked to come to West Point or to Annapolis and Air Force Academy and say the same thing to future military leaders?
Absolutely. First off, and I'll keep it fairly focused on things associated with war, the first is we tend to think of war, and sometimes we say we're going to conquer a piece of ground or we're going to do something that seems very physical. War is about people. War is won in people's minds. It's one, the army that wins is the one that thinks it won. The one that loses is the one that thinks it's losing or has lost. And the population decides which side wins. And that's very counterintuitive when you try to take an empirical look at war. So that's the first thing. It's about people. And so to the degree you are not just moving stuff, you are influencing people. The second is we say the general must have, or military leaders must have a great strategy. In reality, I've come to believe you can do strategy pretty quickly. You and I could sit here in an hour and come out with a workable strategy.
Yeah.
The genius is implementing it. And to implement it means you've got to do a number of things. First, you've got to articulate it clearly, constantly, and have it understood. People have got to believe that you are absolutely committed to it and that you will provide the kind of focus. If you state your strategy different every day, they wait till the next day to hear one they like, and they withhold action. They've got to believe it's consistent commitment. They have got to believe that they are part of it. You've got to convince people, your soldiers, your civilians, and the people, that this is a strategy that they not only will benefit from, but they must contribute to. So they don't want to see General McChrystal's strategy. They want to see our strategy, and they have to accept that. So it becomes a people exercise at every level. Then I think the last I'd say is it is about building trust. If there's anything I've come to believe, and I go back and I look at, the 2004 Dream Team, you say, I'm going to build a great team. And so you say, I'm going to go get great talent, and I'm going to put this talent together. That does not equal a great team. A great team does have a component of talent, but the other component is what I call shared consciousness, which is a combination of trust, common purpose, and informed contextual understanding. So together, this entity believes in the same thing and understands, is informed enough to do that well. Then you put those together, and suddenly you have the necessary ingredients to have a truly effective team.
Bob Gates says he supported all the president's decisions with respect to Afghanistan. Did you?
Yes. I would not have recommended. I was asked whether I recommended announcing a July 11 beginning of pulling forces out. But I told him, he asked me point blank, can you accept that? And I said, yes, I could. And I could, and I still can.
Everybody is trying to understand the president and leadership on a whole range of domestic and foreign issues. Give me your sense of him, from your contact with him as a leader, as a commander-in-chief, and as a president.
Of course, I have a very limited aperture on the president. What I found was he had thought very analytically about Afghanistan from the beginning, from when he took the presidency in January of 2009. He thought about it. I think he was frustrated because as he was trying to understand it, he was being given a drumbeat of decisions that had to be made before he'd had time to completely internalize what the situation was. And so I think he was being asked to make another commitment first, almost the day he took over. And so I think that caused great frustration. And what that did was it caused him to be skeptical of the information he was getting and whether people were trying to push him too fast. And of course, the problem is events on the battlefield, push that. I think the next part is I think he, and I'm speculating on this, but I think he had a natural lack of familiarity with how the military works. Anyone would. That is not a criticism. Anyone who deals with a different culture or group of people, it takes a while to get that. If you're doing it really sort of for the first time as the President of the United States, you're not only trying to feel more comfortable with that culture, but you're doing it as their commander. And so I think he was trying very hard to balance the fact that he had responsibilities as a commander, his loyalty and leadership. Military have a demeanor that they develop over many years. We wear uniforms that overtly describe where we've been, what we've done, what our rank is, and whatnot. And in some ways, we benefit from the fact it looks impressive and people can ooh and ah. And sometimes when you enter a room, you get more respect than you, as an individual, have earned. So we sometimes use that persona. We feel comfortable in it. But at the same time, it creates a divide between us and other people.
Tell me about how you see Navy SEALs and what they represent, and what kind of person comes out of that training.
Sure. And I'm going to expand it to include the special operators I worked with. So the Navy SEALs were part of them. Other special operations units. They are pretty unique. The first is they have decided to volunteer for a more difficult but a more elite type of service. And I think in many cases it's because what they're really looking for is to belong to something that challenges them as individuals, but allows them to sit at a table with people they admire and be considered an equal. And that's a very addictive feeling if you're suddenly around people that would otherwise be your heroes and they look at you as somebody that they respect. They are headstrong often. You can't lead them the same way you lead conventional troops. You've got to engage them. In fact, the best way I found to engage really good special operators was not to tell them what to do, but to describe a problem, to say, I've got this problem. Do you think it can be solved? And they look at it and they go, well, we think we could. And you say, how would you do that? They describe it. And then you say, would you be willing to do that? And even though it might be a very, very dangerous mission. And then they make the call. And whatever.
What are you training? Are you training, is it toughness of mind?
It's problem solving. And it is problem solving not just from a logical sense, but from an emotional sense. If you give me a problem and you say, solve that problem, and you give me a bunch of things I can't do or limits and resources, then I can come back and say, I can't do it, I don't have enough money, I don't have time, you name it. And I got a crutch and I just go on and we stay mediocre. I had a boss, Bill Garrison, who commanded JSOC in Mogadishu. Wonderful guy. We sat in an after-action review one time, and the communications in an aircraft hadn't worked. And he said, I want it fixed. And he's got a bunch of really mealy-mouthed answers. And he said, now, wait a minute. Listen. Whatever equipment you have to buy, I'll buy for you. Whatever experts you have to hire to come in and train, I'll do. Whatever other exercises you need to do, I will schedule. No excuses. No constraints, no excuses. And suddenly you take away from people the idea that they've got a ready reason why they can't be great.
Right. And I would do it, but.
Yes.
You take away the but.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now, I just ask these questions, too, because of what you're doing now. I mean, you're teaching Yale. You have something called the McChrystal Group. You're writing another book that's going to capture the essence of some of these ideas, I think. I mean, tell me what this is all about.
Yeah, they're all related because I'm just fascinated by leadership in the current environment. And what I would tell you is my experience in Iraq and reinforced in Afghanistan was that for many, many years, really since Frederick Winslow Taylor came up with scientific management, we worshipped at the altar of efficiency. Really good assembly lines, reductionism to the point where we could break everything down to individual tasks, and if we did those tasks to a high standard, we'd be very efficient, and if we're very efficient, we will be very effective. Well, what I think happened is you can only get the most efficient solution. You can solve for Y, for how much X you need, only if you really know what Y is. And we're in a world now where things are changing so fast, we no longer know what the requirement is for tomorrow. So we can't build a perfect process because we don't know what the output has to be. So the new holy grail, in my view, our view, is adaptability. Building an organization that is organically, automatically designed to be adaptable. It is by necessity designed to look for moving targets, developing good enough solutions constantly to do that. In that vein, 2 former SEALs who worked for me, and then a young Yale student who was a very bright guy. We are co-writing a book about this system, which we call CrossLead. And it's going to show the history of it, but it's also going to show not just military examples, but business examples and government examples that we've been researching, and some that our firm, McChrystal Group, has been partnering with civilian companies to do. We don't work in any defense or government. We don't do what a lot of people expect ex-military to do. We are partnered with a very different part of the environment and enjoying it.
It's great to have you here.
Thank you very much, Charlie.
General McChrystal's book is called My Share of the Task. It's a memoir updated with a new preface, and it is now in paperback. Back in a moment. Stay with us. Ray Odierno is here. He is a 4-star general and the 38th Chief of Staff of the United States Army. He is best known for successfully implementing the 2007 surge and for his unit's capture of Saddam Hussein exactly 10 years ago. I am pleased to welcome General Odierno to this table.
Thank you. It's great to be here, Charlie.
Take me back to that moment and what that meant.
Well, at the time, it was important. We had been really looking for him for about 6 months. You know, we had started in about June of 2003, and we had figured out early on that we were going about it wrong in the beginning. We were worried. You know, we had the cards, and you had the faces on the cards, and we thought they were somehow related, but we realized they weren't. What it was about is understanding who his trustful inner circle was, and it had a lot to do with family, people he grew up with. And so, you know, working very closely with our special operations forces, we started to put the puzzle together. We probably did 30, 40 raids thinking we were close, but and finally, you know, on December 13th, we got him. And you know, we thought we had a pretty good lead, but I remember waiting and getting the call that, in fact, we had the code they used, number 1, that we had captured number 1. And at the time, it was very important because, you know, we went in and toppled his regime. You know, with him still out there, there was always question, what would that mean? So I think it was very important for us to capture him, to make sure that he would never be able to come back and terrorize the Iraqi people.
What did we learn from him once he was...
Well, I'm not sure how much we learned. I mean, I think we learned a little bit about the inner workings of the government. We learned about how, in fact, he fooled all his people that work for him. You know,
that's the interesting point, isn't it? That almost he was trying not to fool the United States, but his own people, so that they would be in fear, and the Iranians.
Yeah, I mean, what was interesting is my time in Iraq. All the generals I talked to were part of their regime. They were absolutely, and they still are to this day. They would still argue that we had nuclear weapons, we had chemical weapons, they were there, they've been moved and hidden somewhere. They all still believe
That's what they thought.
They still believe it today. Yeah. And that we just didn't find them. And so it's very interesting. So people always ask, well, how do we get... Well, when your own people and the people closest to you, who are your generals, think you have it, then you understand maybe why we certainly believe he had them as well. And so it's very interesting. As I look back on that, I say to myself, why didn't he just then let the inspectors come in? But for him, that was weakness. That showed weakness. He had to continue to show that he was in charge of that regime, that he was a leader in that region. And by admitting that he didn't have these weapons, I think he felt it would show that he had a significant amount of weakness.
Do you believe he thought that we would never attack?
I absolutely believe that. I think he thought he was going to be able to handle it, and that we would not come in there.
So it would be a light attack, but it wouldn't be what it was.
It would not be what it was. It would not be a regime change. We would put a little pressure on, then maybe negotiate a little more. You know, of course, there's lots of varying opinions on that, but he miscalculated. And I think as I look to now in the future, that's what I worry about, is miscalculations by other leaders based on their interpretation of our actions.
Here's a quote, and you'll appreciate this. This is Fred Kagan, who said about you and General Petraeus in 2008 after you had just returned from Iraq. He said, great commanders often come in pairs, Eisenhower and Patton, Grant and Sherman, Napoleon and Davout, Caesar and Labienus, Generals David Petraeus and Raymond Odierno. can now be added to the list. He said that the subordinate in every successful campaign pair has played a key role in designing and implementing the campaign plan, and that history does not always justly appreciate such contributions. In your words, why did the surge work? All of us, understand that the awakening was taking place, and therefore you inputted then additional American troops. But it's got to be much more complicated than that.
Well, I think actually I would argue it's a bit opposite. The awakening happened when they realized we were putting more troops in, and they felt
even though it hadn't been some examples of that under General Petraeus,
but they were very
north.
But they were very small. I mean, so what had happened is we had gone through a time of almost civil war between the Sunni and Shia. But when the Americans came with greater numbers, we were able to go over greater distances, cover more areas, and the people felt much more comfortable then coming forward because they were tired of the violence. Al-Qaeda had worn out its welcome on the Sunni side. They didn't want interference from Iran. So when we decided to put more people on the ground, it gave them more confidence, and that's when they really started to come forward. And so that, in my mind, that's what happened. They were ready to do it. We then provided them the security to do it. There's also a couple other things. It was about getting out among the population. It was about us understanding that we had to be out there with the Iraqis and with the Iraqi army and police to make them feel comfortable, that they felt secure. Once they felt secure, they would come forward. They would tell us who are the individuals that weren't trying to provide peace and security in the region. And so it was about getting them out among the people. It was about regaining their trust. And with the additional forces that we had, it enabled us to do that. And it enabled us then to conduct more broader operations and more specific targeted operations onto only those individuals that were leading and conducting the violence inside of Iraq. So it enabled us to do that together with our special operations forces. So all of that came together. We all, for me, the big realization in all of this was we were always focused inside of Baghdad. I had a conversation with a couple of the Iraqi leaders when I initially got over there for the second time, and they told me, really the key is always the outside of Baghdad, the ring around Baghdad. That's really what controls what goes on inside of Baghdad. And then we uncovered a map in one of our raids from Al-Qaeda, and the Al-Qaeda plan was to control the outskirts of Baghdad. So I then realized, okay, that's what we have to focus on. We have to control the access to Baghdad. And so we put a lot of effort into putting some people more in Baghdad, but also taking control north, south, east, west of Baghdad and putting a ring around it where it made it very difficult for people to come in and out. And so it was a combination of all those things, and that's what we needed the additional people for, which allowed us to provide better security. But in reality, the success was on the backs of the young commanders, the captains, the lieutenant colonels, and the soldiers who executed this and did it with their ability to adapt, and the flexibility they showed and the ingenuity they showed in executing this was important. So what I learned as a leader is I got to give them right and left limits and let them operate within those limits. And what they were able to achieve was quite significant. And we see the same thing going on in Afghanistan as well.
Much has been written by Tom Ricks and others about that you went to Iraq as one person, as one Army officer.
Yeah.
And you came out of Iraq as a different kind of Army officer.
Yeah.
In your own words.
Yeah, I would just say I think it's mischaracterized a little bit.
A little bit.
I felt, but we all changed. I mean, you all learn. The key of being a key leader is you got to continue constantly learn.
Yeah. So what did you learn?
And so I learned a couple things. I learned first that in order to be successful in this environment and in the future environments, you've got to take a multi-pronged approach. The thing I learned most is you got to ask the question why. Why is something happening? Because it's not that it happened or what happened, it's why it happened. If you understand why something happened, then you can pick the tool that's the best tool to solve that problem. And in some cases, we were picking the wrong tool to solve a problem. And you got to understand some of the tools are you have to use full military power to do it. Some is you might have to use economic ability. You might have to do some social things. You might have to do some political things. But if you figure out why something happened, then you can come up with the right solution. And I think early on, I didn't think about the why enough. But as I grew in more experience, I understood that we had to understand why this event was happening. And then once we understood that, we could figure out the right tools. Or we could give the commanders the right information so they could figure out the right tools to use. And I think that's what I learned. And that's why as I look to the future, as I develop our leaders of the future, it's about them understanding how to operate in these complex environments. And you must understand the social-economic aspects, the culture, and everything else, so you can determine... And the religious. Yeah. So you can determine why something has happened. And then you can come up with a much better solution to solve the problem.
And that's what you're trying to teach the young Army officers coming out of West Point to go into the U.S. Army.
That's right. Yeah. And even in all of our military schools, our command and general staff colleges, our war colleges, we are changing how we do this.
There is this, and you do think this is an accurate criticism, that in Iraq and in Afghanistan, we didn't use those... even if we asked the question why, or you asked the question, we didn't use the tools as well as we would have liked. For whatever reason, whether it was corruption, whether it was security issues, the employment of those cultural, economic, social, religious understandings did not come into play in the way you envisioned.
In the beginning, for sure. And we learned it as we went ahead. And as we learned more, we got a hell of a lot better out of it. That's what I would say. Now, there's a couple lessons I learned, though. In terms of when you come into a place where what I call there's instability. And so the other term we'd always look at is what were the drivers of instability? Mm-hmm. So what was really driving instability? Was it security? Was it fear? Was it the fact that nobody had any jobs? Was it the fact that that there's a combination of no jobs and trying to raise a family? And so what we had to figure out is once we figured out what was driving the instability, that allowed us then to put the right tool. And that's what we learned, is you have to understand what those drivers of instability, why is it happening? What is causing this? And, we learned that it's a joint effort. It has to be an interagency effort. It has to be intergovernmental. And even with non-governmental organizations. And you got to figure out where you have common objectives, common goals, and you work together to solve those. It took us a while to understand that. It took a while for some of the other organizations to trust us, to work with us, whether it be the UN, whether it be NGOs, even our, working together, building a strong relationship with our own State Department and other. And so that happened on the ground. We don't want that to happen again. We want to have those relationships built now prior. So we understand how to work with each other. We understand each other's, even our own cultures, and how we can work together and what we're trying to accomplish. So if we have to go somewhere else, we're already prepared to deal in this joint interagency, intergovernmental, multinational environment that we're going to be asked to operate in.
I think it was General Sherman who said war is hell, but at the same time, it is often said, that it is the military people, most of all, who least like to go to war.
Anybody who's experienced war will never want to do it again unless they have to, because they understand the sacrifices, they understand the chaos, they understand the sacrifice that goes on. Unfortunately, I have several friends and several young men and women who I know personally who've given their lives for this country, who've been severely injured for their country, who did it because they want to protect our security. And so I will be prepared, and we'll do everything I can to get our soldiers prepared to do that. But those of us who've experienced, you don't want to do it unless you have to. But when we do it, we're going to be damn good at it when we have to do it, because that helps preserve our young men and women, which is our national treasure.
That's what the country expects of you and the president.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure to have you
Thank
here.
you very much.
Major General H.R. McMaster is here. He is commander of the Army's Maneuver Center for Excellence in Fort Benning, Georgia. In 2005 and 2006, he led the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment in Iraq, successfully defeating the insurgency in the city of Tal Afar. He also directed the Joint Anti-Corruption Task Force in Kabul, Afghanistan, from 2010 to 2012. Last month, Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel nominated him for his 3rd star, the rank of Lieutenant General. Starting in July, he will oversee the Army's think tank, which focuses on the future of warfare. I am pleased to have Major General H.R. McMaster back at this table. Welcome.
Charlie, thanks. It's great to be with you.
You as well. So tell me what your new responsibilities are.
Well, it's a real privilege to continue serving in any capacity, but it's particularly exciting to be able to join an organization whose mission it is to make sure that our Army is prepared as part of the joint force to deter conflict, to respond to crises, and if necessary, fight and win in future war. And you know, as Americans, we don't expect to, and we ought not to have fair fights. So we want to give our forces every advantage we can give them. And so the first order of business is to sort of lay a strong conceptual foundation that defines the problem of future war, and then how we have to prepare our forces to fight and win in future armed conflict.
Are we now prepared to fight 2 wars at the same time?
Well, I think it's been clear from public statements recently that that old defense strategy of being able to fight 2 wars simultaneously is no longer feasible, given the size of the force and the capabilities and the projections for the defense budget. So the key is, as General Odierno, our Chief of Staff of the Army, has spoken about, and the Vice Chief of Staff has spoken about just in this past week, is really we believe that our Army can do the minimum to support the current defense strategy, which is to fight one major contingency operation, hold on to another one, and be able to respond to that one later. At a force sizing of about 450,000, but that's really cutting it close there. Of course, there are dangers that will fall below that level, but of course, as military officers, we don't make those decisions. In a democracy, you get the Army that the people are willing to pay for, and it's our job as general officers and leaders to do the best we can with those resources and make sure we do right by the nation and we do right by our soldiers.
Let me talk about something that you write about with interest, and this is why I think people like General Petraeus, like you, and people like me who like to read what you say. The first is revolution in military affairs.
Right.
What do you mean by that?
Well, this orthodoxy of the revolution in military affairs, it really gained a lot of momentum in the 1990s. And it actually set us up for a lot of the difficulties that we had in both Afghanistan and in Iraq. And this is the idea that advances in technology, and in particular communications technologies, information technologies, computing power, precision munitions, had made war wholly new. And the future wars were going to really exhibit a high degree of discontinuity with all wars that had gone before it. And so the fundamental assumption was that the application of these technologies to war would make war fast, cheap, efficient, and allow us to dominate any opponent. I mean, the language surrounding this orthodoxy was pretty, arrogant.
A lot of that came out of the Gulf War in '91, did it not?
It did. And so
we had such superior military force.
We did. And I think it was a misunderstanding, though, of the result of the Gulf War that really led to a lot of it. So the conventional wisdom became, in the wake of the Gulf War, that the technologies that had demonstrated really tremendous ability and potential in the Gulf War were going to be decisive in future wars. But in those explanations undervalued the training and professionalism of our force that gave us a tremendous advantage along with the technology. It also undervalued really the Iraqis' approach to the war. I mean, I think you could say that there are 2 fundamental ways to fight the U.S. military: asymmetrically and stupid.
Yes.
And I think the Iraqis in 1991 chose stupid. And many of them fought with great courage and honor, but they were overmatched in ways they could not even imagine because they had been at war with the Iranians from 80 to 88, and they were used to infantry walking at them. Now you had armored formations that could fire and move forward at the same time, and we had forces that were tremendously confident, well-trained, and so these aspects of our overmatch, I think, were underappreciated.
Who's fought the best asymmetrical war against the United States?
Gosh, well, I mean, I think all our adversaries have tried, right, and to some degree or another, and you can go back obviously to the frontier wars, and the wars against Native American tribes, which were fundamentally asymmetrical. I think that you can look at the fights that we've had in the Philippines during the Philippines insurrection, fundamentally asymmetrical. So
asymmetrical means
it's common sense, right? I mean, if you see an enemy has certain strength, you don't want to impale yourself on that strength.
Yes.
You want to go around that strength and take advantage of weaknesses. And so
most revolutionary forces are asymmetrical.
They are, because they come at the problem set from a position of military weakness.
Right.
And so they have to really organize military operations in a way that allows them to strike at strengths and to make contact with us and to fight us on their own terms. And also, they operate on multiple battlegrounds. All of our enemies do, of course.
Did the insurgency in Iraq have that ability?
Yes, it did. I mean, the insurgency in Iraq, I think, initially what we encountered there was a decentralized, localized, hybrid insurgency that coalesced over time. And what was striking about this insurgency, and I think as well also the insurgency in Afghanistan, is that they continually evolved based on how they saw our responses to their actions against us. So, for example, initially the Iraqis, the Iraqi insurgency was really driven toward inflicting casualties on us, and they thought we would leave. And Saddam had handed out copies of Black Hawk Down and said, "You kill some Americans, they'll leave." Mm-hmm. And of course, when that wasn't working, they shifted toward attacking infrastructure, make people miserable, grow pools of popular discontent from which you can draw strength. Then they began to attack nascent Iraqi security forces, before they could develop the resiliency to withstand those attacks. But then ultimately, they formed this alliance of convenience between former Saddamists and Takfirist or Salafi jihadist organizations associated with al-Qaeda. This is when Zarqawi came into the picture. And their strategy became to perpetuate and accelerate a sectarian civil war, create a chaotic environment, and out of that chaotic environment try to establish control in certain territories and over some of the population.
But the surge drove a wedge between that relationship.
It did. And I think ultimately we responded to that evolution of the conflict. We were behind. I think we were behind in the beginning, mainly based on ignorance of the problem set there. That had, I think, quite a bit to do with that orthodoxy and the revolution in military affairs, the idea that we would, in the future, be able to conduct what was called at the time rapid, decisive operations, neglecting some of the continuities in the nature of war, the political dimension of war, the human dimension of war. War is inherent uncertainty. War is a contest of wills. And so we went from ignorance, though, I think early in the Iraq War, it's fair to say from maybe a policy perspective that we went from ignorance to denial to a certain extent. We didn't want to really acknowledge that this was an insurgency, to acknowledge that this was a threat to our vital interests and our ability to consolidate those initial military gains in Iraq and get to a sustainable political outcome there consistent with our interests. And so as the insurgency continued to evolve, well, we didn't maybe adapt fast enough. And I think when you saw that adaptation was toward the end of 2006, beginning of 2007, when it was clear that the dominant feature of the war in Iraq had become this very destructive sectarian civil war that still had a problem of insurgency associated with it, still had a problem of transnational terrorism associated with it. But then we were able, in 2007, to reassess the situation, ask the right questions, and then develop a strategy and an operational plan to address it.
Is it fair to say, and that the modern American textbook on counterinsurgency came out of the Iraq War?
I think so.
I think it was, and you and others.
Right, but there can be no textbook on insurgency. I think this is where people get confused sometimes, because counterinsurgency is sort of a
But did he write a manual?
He did write a manual, but in our Army, doctrine helps you conceptualize, but isn't supposed to give you the answer. It's like what Karl von Clausewitz, the great Prussian philosopher of war, said. Military theory is not to accompany you to the battlefield. It is, and tell you what to do. It's just like an old professor prepares a student, but then the student has to go on and make his own way. So it's not designed to give you a strategy. So I think when some people, criticize, I think now what's become very fashionable, almost conventional wisdom, say, "Oh, look, that didn't work. Counterinsurgency theory doesn't work. Look what happened in Iraq." Well, of course, counterinsurgency theory was never designed to be, never meant to be a strategy. And so it can help you ask the right questions, right? It can help you, access previous best practices. But ultimately, you have to understand each of these problem sets on their own terms.
Second fallacy, zero dark 30 is a fallacy. And we know what that means, but I'll have you tell me, which is the idea that special ops can take care of everything.
Well, I think that the danger of these fallacies is that they confuse important capabilities. I mean, for vitally important capabilities, for strategies and for the answer to future war. So just as the RMA assumes that you can solve the problem of future war by applying firepower onto land from the aerospace and maritime domains. The zero dark 30 fallacy is that really all you need is a global sort of SWAT team that can do raids against nodes in an enemy organization, and you can do that very efficiently for a relatively low cost. And of course, what our special operations forces do is amazing. I mean, it's a tremendous capability. It's keeping us safe. They're incredible professionals.
But how is it different than what you just said?
Well, because, of course, the enemy has a say, right? And so our enemies apply countermeasures to all of these capabilities. I mean, there are traditional countermeasures, dispersion, concealment, intermingling with civilian populations. There are technological countermeasures to these sort of capabilities. And then, of course, all enemy organizations are not the same. And so we, because of our global interests and because of our vital interests and those of our key partners and allies, can be placed at risk by nation states and the fielded forces of nation states, and also these sort of networked organizations that are quite dangerous, because a lot of these organizations, I think you can look at Hezbollah as an example. You can look at some of the insurgent organizations that we fought. I think in Syria, if you look at Al-Nusra Front, for example, if you look at ISIS there in Syria, if you look at Hezbollah's operations in Syria itself, these are non-state actors who have capabilities previously associated only with the fielded forces of nation states.
Right.
And those are destructive weapons, it's communications, it's the ability to mobilize resources, sufficient financial
But are they
resources.
dependent on nation states to provide them with the weapons they use?
Often, yes. And so this is this nexus, I think, between hostile nations and these forces. So, for example, what would Hezbollah be without Iran, really? And what would Al-Qaeda and associated groups be without at least the ability to establish support bases and safe havens within the boundaries of certain nation states? And so I think it's important for us to be able to deter nation states as well as non-state actors, but also to be able to respond to crises involving the fielded forces of nation states and these so-called hybrid enemies.
But there's a strong sentiment in the country, I think, and you hear it in terms of conversations, that a lot of people look and think that the future of modern warfare is paramilitary and special ops kinds of forces.
Right.
And sometimes it is characterized as sort of, a counter-terrorist warfare rather than counter-insurgency warfare.
Right. I think that's a fair statement. I think people would like war to be sort of a problem that you can address just by raiding. And this is sort of, I call it a sort of a raiding mentality, right? Because it doesn't get you involved in all those difficult things on land, like people and populations and security. But of course, these enemies are able to operate in and amongst populations. They obviously go to areas that are particularly weak, not under state control. And so it's important to work with partners, and we have to have the capability ourselves to.
If I remember correctly, you made your first reputation in terms of an analysis of the Vietnam War.
Yes.
And part of what came out of the Vietnam War is hearts and minds.
Right.
That seems to me to still be relevant to modern warfare, if in fact it's a counterinsurgency that you're fighting.
That's right.
Because you depend on them for, among other things, intelligence, i.e. information.
Right. And what we see, what is common, I think, to many of these conflicts, and of course all of them have unique dynamics associated with them, but what's common, I think, in Syria, what's common with the conflict in Yemen, what you see in northern Nigeria, what you see in Libya today, what you saw in Mali, what you see in many other places, Afghanistan,
most
Pakistan.
of the hotspots except
most of the
Ukraine.
Hotspots. Right. And what you see is these transnational terrorist organizations who take advantage of local competitions, political competitions, for power, resources, and survival, and then they portray themselves as patrons and protectors of one of the aggrieved parties. And that's how they gain access. And then once they gain access, you see what they've done in Syria. They establish control. They have their own agenda, and they establish control through brutality, murder, intimidation. And so the only way that you can really defeat those organizations is for some force to be able to lift that pall of fear, to lift that intimidation off the population.
But we have no force that's doing that other than the force of the Syrian army today. And they have their own fear element and all element of obscene warfare.
That's absolutely right. And I'm not saying we should do this. I mean, that's a policy decision certainly, but I think we just don't want to be delusional about the ability to achieve or to help the Syrian people achieve some sort of sustainable outcome there in Syria that does anything less than establish security under some sort of political
Then where's
control.
it going to come from in Syria?
Well, I mean, that's the real problem there.
That's not a policy question. That's a strategy problem.
Well, because the society is becoming more fractious and more fragmented as this cycle of sectarian violence continues, and you have
and even elements of people that are your enemy are fighting each other.
That's right.
With levels of violence.
Right. And what's I think important about the Syria problem is to how we think about it. I mean, we've got to really ask the first order questions as we have here. I think what is the real nature of the conflict? There's been some great work done on that by International Crisis Group and others that really summarizes the nature of the conflict. And then given that nature of the conflict, what can be done? With all of these problems, right? I mean, each of the ones I mentioned, there is an internal dimension, which in Syria is getting worse and worse. There's also an external dimension to the problem. And what some have suggested is the need for the international community to work at this problem from the outside in. And to try to prevent, obviously, the conflict from expanding geographically, becoming more destructive, becoming even more of a humanitarian crisis. But then to try to begin to work towards some sort of a political outcome that can break that cycle of violence. And then ultimately there has to be some kind of an internal political accommodation, right, or settlement that removes support for these extremist groups who find it is in their interest to perpetuate the violence. Yeah. And what happens in a lot of these cases is you have sort of a wartime economy that begins to be self-perpetuating, and you have powerful people inside of a power vacuum, really, who see it as in their interest to perpetuate the conflict.
The Marlon Perkins of the Mutual of Omaha Wild Kingdom fallacy, which was that Marlon Perkins, wherever he was staying, he was not on the battlefield of wildlife. But he sent Jim Fowler to do that.
Right.
And your point is?
The point is, I think we're searching for these easy solutions to the problem of future war. And one of the easy solutions that we are in danger of seizing upon is, hey, we'll just get other armies to do that land war stuff for us. And then Jim, essentially, and we'll be like Marlon Perkins. We'll stand off. We'll provide them some capabilities, some advisors, and so forth. But of course, this again ignores important continuity in the nature of war, which is essentially political. And so it depends on the degree to which your interests, first of all, align with those of your partners that you would want to fight for on your behest. And it also has a lot to do with the interests of these various groups. And
Major General H.R. McMaster, thank you.
Thanks, Charlie.
Pleasure to have you here.
It's always great to talk to you. Thank you.